Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today, let's have a conversation about epidemiology. I am just getting acquainted with a new friend, Dr. Professor David Waltner Tays, who is an epidemiologist at the University of Guelph in population medicine, I believe. He's published a lot of books, and one I've been reading with great pleasure because he's such an excellent writer. And it's because he's also a poet. He's written poetry books. And he's produced a hell of a lot of research papers as well. So we're going to have a good conversation about ecology and health, I would say. I began immediately 3 minutes ago asking him about the organization of how the structure is organized to promote epidemiological progress as an international organization. And he began telling me all kinds of extremely interesting things about the organization and the history of the movement and so on. So I'm going to ask him to start all over again and share it with you. So good morning, Dr. Waltner Tays.
Good morning. Yes, I was, my background actually in terms of the writing was, my first degree was in literature. Yeah? And then went back and I decided I couldn't make a living as a poet and went into veterinary medicine, spent a couple of years in private practice, and then studied epidemiology. Part of it is I kept asking why. You know, if this animal is sick, why is that? Because it's this context, and why is that context there? And you keep asking why, and soon enough you end up with the world we live in. Why is it the way it is?
No, everybody, all of the people that I talk to ask why. Yeah. But you ask things like you describe. I was just reading about your description of a fighting cock chicken. Mm-hmm. And I could just see that beautiful animal. So not many people write poetry in their research papers.
Well, I discovered at some point, I've done a lot of international work. I mean, between my beginning university and ending up in veterinary medicine, I was one of those people that vagabonded around the world and, you know, went through Europe, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and so on. And then when I eventually became a veterinarian and then an epidemiologist, we spent 2 years living in Indonesia, myself and our family. And then I did a lot of, when I started at University of Guelph, I began to do a lot of research projects in Kenya, Uganda, Nepal, Southeast Asia, especially on avian influenza, Southeast Asia. My specialty is diseases other animals share with people or we share with them, either through the environment or directly in various ways. And one of the things I drew on was trying to work. I initially began doing conventional epidemiologic studies. So you go in and you do a standard study and you do the lab work for it and all these kind of things. And then I realized, but it didn't change anything. And I didn't go into this to just gather information. I was interested in having positive changes be made in these communities. So then I began working with local grassroots organizations as part of the research. So we would have science and communication and social action and looking at who's doing what. And then things began to change. But then I had to go back and think about, well, what was it about my original approaches that didn't allow for that? It wasn't just that we didn't recognize that there were social determinants or environmental determinants of disease. It was that the methods we were using couldn't accommodate them very well. You're building these statistical models and graphs, and where do people fit into this? Mm-hmm. So I began looking at other ways of doing this, and I discovered that, and I mentioned this earlier to you, that in Canada and the United States, there was something called the International Joint Commission of the Great Lakes. And they had science advisory committees, and I began talking to some of those people. And they were looking at the health of human settlements around the Great Lakes. They were looking at the integrity of the Great Lakes, agricultural runoff. So they were looking at all the things I was interested in, and zoonotic diseases. And so there was a kind of movement that came out of that. There was something initially called ecosystem health. And then for various reasons, because in ecology, there's a conflict, a dynamic between looking at ecology as different species competing on the same landscape, which is kind of a conventional way, to looking at it more systemically. How does everything interact in a particular place? And the people that pushed for that systemic approach, there are a lot of good things about it, because you see how different species interact, so that you have certain kinds of forests that attract certain kinds of deer and ticks and mice and trees, and then you have Lyme disease in that system. The challenge of that is that it's hard to draw boundaries. As as a veterinarian, I can look at
you mentioned that notion that an ecosystem would have boundaries, and I don't know. I was at the time trying to think of what difference that makes empirically in the kind of work you do. What difference does it make whether you're talking about a niche or an area that has boundaries and that doesn't?
Well, the boundaries, if I want to say an ecosystem is, let's say, healthy, then the question is, what are the boundaries of this healthy ecosystem? Now, if I'm talking about an animal, I can say this is the shape of the animal, and this animal is healthy. That doesn't mean the household it's in is healthy or the environment it lives in. It means that this animal is healthy. It's a porous boundary, even at that level. But certainly when you get to ecosystems, the porosity is much more evident, because you've got a lot of species migrating across. So are you talking about only the animals and people that live in the Grand River watershed where I live? Or what about the air and water movements that come across here, the storms, the migrating birds that come through several times a year? How do we accommodate that in terms of defining health? What my view is that we learn something by doing this. I mean, we learn, if you look at it as a system, you learn all kinds of things about local dynamics. If you look at it as different species in competition, you can get a much broader view. I mean, with a pandemic, the boundaries are feral. I mean, they've gone all over the place, right? You can have a localized disease, but suddenly it's all over the place. So where are the boundaries of that? How does one talk about One Health, for instance, in that context? Where can we define boundaries? So I began working with other people, looking at these things, and looking at what the different possibilities were. And the Science Advisory Group for the International Great Lakes, they described an ecosystem as being something we use to describe the complexity of nature out there. So we don't know everything that's going on outside around us, but we create certain kinds of models, and those models are what we think of as ecosystems. So they're not a totally abstract construction out of our heads, but they're not everything. If you want to see how everything reacts with everything else, you step outside, and the best model you can build is just watching the world go by. What we do is we select what are the things we think are important, how do they interact with each other, and then where are some boundaries on that. So the things we select are the things we think are important. They might be charismatic megafauna, they might be livestock or cats or dogs or people. And we don't just pick them randomly. We pick them because, one, they're important to us, but two, because we think that they are important in the dynamic of what's going on around us. So you might see people pick a panda or an owl in the forest, not just because they're cute, but because they have important roles. We think they've got important roles to play in the forests that they live in. So there's some kind of a dynamic there. But we don't pick out everything, every possible animal in the forest or every possible animal in the bamboo thicket. We pick the things that we think are important. And it's always it's from my point of view, it's necessary to keep coming back to that we're describing something using the best tools we have to achieve certain kinds of goals. We could be wrong. We make mistakes. It's like, being a veterinarian, you do a best judgment call. You bring in lab data, history, where's this animal been? What's it been eating? Where does it live? All of these kind of things. And you make a judgment call. And it's the best one we have. And you can, I could still be wrong. The challenge comes when we start talking about something like One Health, if we use that term, is we don't have a single owner, a single animal. We've got multiple people all over the place. They're all making decisions, and they have different values. They're picking different things. So getting a history is a challenge. Trying to describe this, if we want to call it an animal, is a challenge. My background in this field has been coming through the ecological side, and that's partly because that's where my interest has been. It's partly because in Canada, as I explained earlier, we had a Minister of the Environment, Lucien Bouchard, who in the early 1990s said, okay, we've got enough of this medical research, veterinarians, natural sciences, social sciences. We're going to force them to work together. And I'm going to have a huge pot of money, millions of dollars. And these researchers, they can't say, well, we're going to have some medical research and then attach some social research or ecological research. They have to adjudicate these projects in an integrated fashion. They all have to agree. And that the research councils went into that kicking and screaming. And they just, that's not how we do things. We do medical research, natural sciences, humanities, social sciences and humanities. And I was fortunate to be just starting my research career at that point, and I got a large pot of money to look at something we called agroecosystem health. So if we're looking at landscapes in Southern Ontario, you can say what a healthy farm might be, but what's a healthy agricultural ecosystem? Where do we draw boundaries? How do we determine what, we look at the water, the farmers, all these different kinds of things. And then from there, it spun out and I was doing research in Nepal and Uganda and Kenya and various other places. Now that shift, the money, that kind of a program eventually became established in the International Development Research Center in Ottawa, which was initially had these clear programs, medical, social, these kinds of things. And it was focused on international development.
Now, I asked you a minute ago whether or not that thing still exists.
Oh, yes.
You said yes, but back in when I was teaching, which I've been retired a number of years now, but I used to get those gorgeous magazines that IDRC produced. And I assumed that it was kind of an international publication, global. It seemed to have a global orientation for development. Is that right?
That's correct.
And
the extent to which they engage Canadian researchers is as partners with people elsewhere. So I was working on projects in Nepal and Uganda and Kenya and Peru and various other places, but it was the partners who were driving the research and I was providing some input and expertise. So it was a genuine partnership.
Now, did you mean a little while ago, did you sound like you were setting up a distinction between One Health approach and the IDRC approach? Is that correct? That there's a
okay. What I was trying to say was that the IDRC approach came out of community development on the ground, community engagement, kinds of practices. The One Health approach. In fact, I was at the meeting where there were actually big fights about this. It was an international meeting of the EcoHealth, International Association for Ecology and Health, which is a group of people. And a subset of people from the United States, primarily, some from Australia, wanted to establish something called One Health. And I'd been at meetings before this at One Health in Canada and elsewhere, where they were talking about this. Some of us saw this as in the most cynical way you could say it, was the Americans trying to get a hold of the agenda globally because they didn't like to see everybody else doing this integrated approach. On the plus side, I mean, One Health is a catchy term. It seems to pull things together. In practice, it has tended to be focused on the kinds of things that physicians and veterinarians have traditionally already collaborated on. That is to say, zoonotic diseases, food safety, and there were programs of veterinary public health going back to in the World Health Organization for decades, practically from the beginning.
Okay, now that's news to me, because I did have the impression that One Health was a new thing, and that they're the first people who discovered that animals and people have this, are interdependent.
Well, yeah, and that's it becomes annoying at a certain point, but I try not to let the politics get in the way of some good ideas, because they're not new ideas. They go way back. And in fact, if you go back to the beginnings of medical sciences, if you look at people like Louis Pasteur, they were working on sheep, they were working on people, there wasn't this clear distinction. And a lot of the pioneers in what we now call medicine, human medicine, were in fact natural philosophers, natural scientists. They studied all different kinds of animals. And the first one of the first veterinary schools in Canada was established in Montreal, and their focus was on what they called comparative medicine. So let's look at all the different animals and the kind of diseases they get and how this relates to people. So there was this strong movement. And then in the, let's say, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, as medical technology got better and better, so the delivery of services within a hospital setting, all the support services, lab services, and the professionalization. So veterinarians, you deal with this, physicians, you deal with that. And I can see in clinical practice, I mean, my daughter's a physician, my daughter-in-law is a physician. If you've got somebody come into a hospital or into your clinic, you don't want to be thinking about everything and everything else. Fine. Somebody brings an animal into a veterinary clinic. You don't want to look at how everything relates to everything else. So there's this professionalism. That works when you're doing clinical work.
Hold on. When would you say that began? Because that's such an interesting notion that it was originally one thing and then it was separated. When would you say this separation occurred?
I think it became, let's say, 40s, 50s, 60s. It probably happened most strongly during the Second World War. And one of the things is that the way we think of medicine now, it's most powerful in an emergency situation, right? You want doctors on the front line. They know how to, there's a line of authority. This is the problem. We know how to fix it and we'll fix it. And in order to achieve that most efficiently, then you want professional training. So it began, I would say, probably in the 50s, growing out of that experience in the Second World War, it began to be more and more professionalized. I went through veterinary school in the 70s, and there was some overlap. Certainly there was more recognition, I would say, on the veterinary side than on the medical side. I know when I came on faculty here at the University of Guelph in the 80s, and I was starting up courses on infectious zoonotic diseases people get from animals. And I called around to the medical schools, to McMaster, Toronto, London. The only infectious disease work that was being done was HIV/AIDS. That was it. Nothing else. So foodborne diseases, that's not our problem. Zoonotic diseases, we don't even think about it. So it's only sort of in the 90s, really, that there began to be a recognition that, wait a minute, a lot of these infectious diseases do come from animals. That on the medical side, it began to be recognized. Veterinarians have known this for a long time.
That's so interesting.
So there's all this this, I would say, political interplay. There's going after money. I mean, you've been in the university system, you know that a lot of it comes to where can you get your research grants from, right? And if the research grant says you focus on this, then you say, well, I'm actually interested in this bigger picture, but I'll focus on this and use it as a springboard if you want. And I've always, students would ask me, well, how do I get to do the kind of work that you do? And I'd say, well, you tell them what they want, you get the basic information, and then you subvert it as best you can, right? You do the things you think are important, but you deliver. I still delivered my courses on epidemiology, zoonotic diseases, foodborne diseases, but then I would gradually get people to ask questions. Well, we're having these problems with salmonella. Why do you think that is? It's not just because it's in the, why is it in the chicken, right? And why not somewhere else? Is it more of a problem now than it was before, or is that just because we're better at counting?
Give me some answers to that. Why would salmonella be more in chickens?
It's partly because, well, it's a complicated history. It's partly because of the way we raise them, and that's partly because of the kind of science we've got. Until the Second World War, well, a bit before that, we didn't know what vitamins were. We didn't know what, these were just beginning to be discovered and named. Chickens had to be reared outside because of getting vitamin D, getting the UV light and reacting. So when they figured out what vitamins were and they figured out we can actually manufacture vitamin D, then they could put it in the feed. And then they started, let's crowd them together. So they could crowd them together, and they said, well, some of them are getting sick. We've also discovered post-Second World War, there are these different antibiotics. Maybe if we give them antibiotics, it will help suppress the infections. Well, as any Darwinian, evolutionary biologist could have told them, what you're doing is you're creating selection pressures for certain kinds of resistant organisms and certain kind of organisms that survive better in these circumstances. And it turns out that Salmonella is one of those organisms that can adapt very well to those situations. And the other thing is that because of the way they're raised and slaughtered, even if you've got one or two chickens in a flock, by the time they get to the slaughterhouse, there's so much cross-contamination, on the farm and in the slaughterhouse that it's not just the one chicken, it's the whole flock.
Okay, I didn't even know that they fed antibiotics to chicken. I had heard about
it. They've backed off on that now.
Okay.
It was when I went to school, I'm old enough to remember when they put antibiotics in because not so much to suppress disease, but because it promoted growth.
Yeah, I heard that it fattens them, but I didn't know it was chicken. I thought it was cows and things, but they did it with chickens too from the very get-go. Is that right?
Well, they more likely did it with chickens and also some with pigs, and they did it with chickens at a time when, in fact, chickens were reared under conditions were not exactly clean. And so, in fact, the antibiotics were very effective. It turns out in the last 10, 20 years, some of the largest producers have gone back and said, well, it actually doesn't do any good now because our chicken barns are so clean and so secure. You have to, scrub in and scrub out and so on, that even the biggest producers have backed off from using antibiotics in the feed. But for decades, it was used, as a growth promotant in the feed. And so that, it did suppress disease, but, and they did grow faster, but it's not necessary anymore, even if it was.
But now I had assumed that the reason they're not doing it anymore is because somebody caught on and said, stop it. We won't let you do that anymore. But, but you think that
it's never one thing, right? So you have people caught on to it. And they looked at, they got scientific researchers involved. And scientists looked at this and they said, actually, you're right. It's not just, so you have public pressure. You have independent groups, community-based groups. They get holds of some information. They get, if you want, allies in the scientific world to champion some of these things. It's like Rachel Carson, right? You had people saying for a long time, we shouldn't be using all these pesticides. And she came along and said, okay, here are the scientific data to support you, and then they could work together. And a lot of the real achievements in, let's say, One Health have been in that collaboration between people in the community and the scientific community. I mean,
Okay,
if I
now
look at,
you've already answered me, because before we started, I started complaining about the fact that in my perception,
Mhm,
although most global threats have some sort of big public social movement
mhm,
attached to it that it stimulates real change or political
right,
demand for
right.
change. My sense was that when it comes to public health, there's nothing like that. But you're saying that that public demand or something like a social movement exists to combat something like the misuse of antibiotics. If
Yes.
I'm delighted to know that that's true, because I'm not aware of any such social movement. And that's
Well,
what I'm thinking maybe we need more movements that
I
actually do
think they
that.
are there, and they tend to be focused. I mean, another disease I'm thinking of is Lyme disease,
Mhm.
which for me, and the name is from Lyme and Connecticut, is where the American outbreaks were first detected. And some mothers, they had kids who were diagnosed with arthritis, reactive arthritis. But there were enough kids there, and the mothers were going, this doesn't make any sense. But the local physicians were saying, no, that's just what it looks like. And they finally got a young researcher from Centers for Disease Control to come out. They were so insistent and adamant that this could not be that kind of arthritis. And the guy did the research and discovered, in fact, it was Borrelia burgdorferi, this little organism that lived in ticks that was transmitted between ticks and deer and so on, and that people were picking that up. So you had this social movement, and then finding somebody in the scientific community to work with them to find out what's going on here. So that those social movements exist in that context then.
There's a word, Bartolosis, or something close to that.
Yeah.
Is that what we're talking about with regard to Lyme disease?
It's a similar kind of thing.
Because I did talk to a woman in Louisiana whose son had that, and she's quite the leader of a movement about helping
Right.
people who experience that disease. So I guess I'm persuading myself that I'm wrong, and you're persuading
Well,
me.
I mean, I'm always happy if people can persuade me that I'm wrong. I mean, that to me, that's a sign of a good scientist, that you say, well, best information we have right now is this, but I could be wrong, right? So show me how I might be wrong about this.
Mhm.
And that, for me, is the fun part about working with communities at the ground level.
Mhm.
It's less true at the global One Health level, where people tend to get, and it's partly because these organizations are so big, they change slowly. People get fixed ideas about this is the way things are. And that's one of the things that happened with WHO with COVID-19. There was a group of scientists that said, this couldn't possibly be airborne. We've got the information from the last 30 years. These kind of organisms aren't airborne. But there were people working in engineering and ventilation sciences who said, actually, the physics say it could be airborne.
Mhm.
And they went back and looked at the literature, and it took a while for the more conservative scientists at the global level to change their minds.
Mhm.
But I mean, took about a year, actually, and a lot of people died in the meantime. There's this dynamic in science between this innovation and sometimes the innovation that people seem like crackpots. I mean, I remember going through veterinary school, I was told that prions could not possibly cause disease. They're an effective disease. You see these things on the brain. We knew there was a disease in sheep called scrapie, and there were one or two others, but it wasn't going to cause disease. And then within a decade or two, the person who had argued that they did cause disease and done experiments and all kinds of things, who was originally thought to be a crackpot, he got the Nobel Prize for having discovered, oh, they actually do cause disease. So there's always this dynamic and there's a lag. And I mean, that's there for a reason. You don't want every idea to suddenly become, well, this is what it is. And that's been the danger during the pandemic, because you have all these preprints and people with ideas, and they have one study that says this. Some of them are probably right, but some of them are wrong. And we haven't had enough time to establish which ones might have more of a grounding in reality, and which of them are just, they're fantastic ideas, but we don't have any evidence that they're actually true. So,
you know, that I think is a more general problem even than you're mentioning, because I find, I was just talking to somebody about near-death experiences.
right.
And I'm interested in reading these stories. But the point is that we started talking about other sort of weird experiences that we are skeptical about. And there's a whole continuum, everything from once you believe in something like that strange, then do you believe in the healing power of crystals, or things of that kind, people coming from outer space with big eyes and capturing people and taking them on their spaceships, and there's a whole continuum of weird and implausible things, and there's no logic by which you can say, at least I can't think of a logic by which I can say, well, I believe in this crazy crackpot thing, but I don't believe in this other one, which,
I always remain skeptical, and as long as it's not endangering anybody, it doesn't matter to me what people believe. But I am interested in those kinds of things that fall along that line where one is, I remember when the ideas first came out that the microbes in our gut influenced people's mental states, or people's various other kinds of activities, and people said, this is your gut, bacteria. They're obviously not doing this. And in the last decade, they've done all these studies that, well, actually they do, and they're very much active in our own bodies. And the same thing is true as we move up in the larger questions of world health. What are the dynamics here? What are we looking at? And there are indigenous groups which talk about One Health from a microbiome point of view. So each of these indigenous groups, they grew up in certain areas, they're eating certain foods, they have their own microbiomes. How much is that important when we start shifting people around the world and we eat different kinds of diets and we change the microbial population, and that results in different kinds of diseases? Suddenly we have indigenous people getting diabetes, which they didn't have before, because they're eating different foods and they're in a different context. And it's,
do you believe that is something that we should be paid attention to? I mean, how much would you invest of your own interest in a question like, if you have this body type, don't move to Africa because their body type requires a different kind of food?
Well, I guess I come at this I think about this at two different angles. One of them is in terms of engaging in public policy, public health. And one of the groups I was engaged with a lot, they were establishing environmental policy for the European Union. So they're at there's a center outside of Milan in Ispra, Italy. And they developed something which they call post-normal science. And what they mean is, normal science is you divide the world up into pieces and you do these puzzles in the laboratory, and then eventually you can put it all together. And they're saying it's for some problems where you've got the values are in dispute, the facts are even in dispute. There are high stakes involved if things like climate change or pandemics, where from the beginning, one needs to engage the public, not just scientists and then communicating to the public, but the professional scientists sitting down with the general public and saying, okay, what are the kinds of things you see in your community? How would you define the problems? How do we begin to work together? And we have something to contribute. You have your own experiences to contribute. How do we begin to put this together? And it uses the kind of science that we would have called normal. But it doesn't stop there. It's not sufficient to address these problems. So instead of having scientists and then politics, you bring some of the politics into the science so that it's better able to address real issues where people live. And like you said, it's a slippery slope, right? Because there are all kinds of crackpots out there who have ideas about what the problems are.
Well, not only that,
I think it's worth.
I would be more skeptical about whether or not you can just pick up things from somebody on the street and ask them.
No, it's more structured. It's more structured than that, and that's where the work that's been done in Europe and that I've been involved with. You work with pretty well-defined communities. I mean, I said before the problem of boundaries, right? So it's not about individual health. It's more like the health of the communities we live in. And some of the approaches have used, I think in Quebec, they used this, they used juries, where people got called to jury duty, but it had to do with environmental and public health issues.
Oh, citizens' assemblies.
Something like that, yes. But they would come in and they would be working with professional scientists, and there would be back and forth and debate and assessing different kinds of information. So it wasn't just, talking to random people on the street. There's a kind of a structured approach, because otherwise, like you say, it could be just, anybody in the street has an opinion on everything. And you also get crackpots in the scholarly community, especially now when you've got thousands and thousands of journals. You can usually find a journal that's going to pick up an article, right? It's a challenge. So the One Health notion is a fruitful one, but it's not all defining. It helps organizations get across departmental boundaries. So you have a Ministry of Science and Development or whatever it is, and a Ministry of Health, and they begin collaborating on things. And in some places it may be on something very specific, like rabies in parts of Africa, or other, foodborne diseases or things like that. In other places, it might be more general if you're trying to work at, broader governmental levels. How do you begin to get, the financial people and the scientists and the people who are looking at social programs. When I was working in Nepal, one of the things that came out was that, there was garbage in the streets and people were blaming everybody else. And the street sweepers were mostly women. And they said, you want to solve the dirty streets problem, we need funded daycare. If we don't have funded daycare, we can't get out. We don't know where to leave our kids, or we have to drag our kids out with us in the street where we're gathering the garbage. You give us daycare and we can take care of the garbage in the streets. So it's that kind of collaboration between the scientists and people who live there who say, we understand you want to solve this, but in order to solve that, we need to have this, right? And it might not seem like a direct connection, but it is related.
Yeah, well, okay. This is, you're approaching this from what I guess would be an administrative level. How do you best carve up the world into departments so that you get the best payoff? And I think that's extremely important. I just don't I don't know.
At the community level, and that's why I always enjoyed working with small communities in Africa and Asia and Latin America, departments are not an issue. And that's why IDRC, International Development Research Center, was so helpful in promoting this, because if you're talking about development in Kathmandu or in villages outside of Nairobi, they don't care which department it is. You've got everybody in the village. They have a village council. They sit around, or they've got a town council. In Nepal, I worked with 2 ward councils. It'd be like having the the county council around here. And then we would talk about what the issues were and how they got put together. And they weren't divided up into departments. It's only when you get above that to provincial, national level, global level, that the departments become, they're both useful and they get in the way. And it's
Now, maybe department isn't the word I want, but organizations. Now, for
Right.
example, somebody told me, I don't know whether it is true, that there within the sort of One Health movement, there's a cleavage between the people who do One Health, meaning zoonotic diseases, transfer from animals to people,
Mhm.
and then the other set of organizations that are equally or more interested in the environment. So I think there's something called Eco Health Alliance or something like that.
Yeah.
Where they send people out to the jungle and try to look at what kinds of diseases are endemic in the jungle, and this is part of where their starting point. Whereas somebody working in a veterinary school is not likely to.
Well, the Eco Health Alliance, actually, there are a bunch of veterinarians in there, and I've worked with them before. They've had the same challenge within the organization as the larger organization has.
Oh.
Because what happens is that the money that comes in tends to be targeted at zoonotic diseases. So people like Peter Daszak and so on, they've gravitated toward doing epidemiologic modeling, which is great, but it doesn't get at the underlying questions. It's not that they're not interested in it, it's that the interest of governments is, we want to know how to control this disease, right? So the focus has been on that, and that's fair enough. But my friends that work on wildlife, including those within Eco Health Alliance, there are several of them there, they tend to get sidelined, or they tend to get pulled in only if there is a public health interest on the behalf of the government. So my friends in Canada who worked on wildlife issues for many, many years, working out of a shoebox, basically, when avian influenza came along, suddenly there was money. We want you to do monitoring of ducks and geese as they migrate. The interest wasn't in the wildlife per se, it was in whether or not they were contributing to human health or to diseases in farm animals. And that's always been a challenge. I mean, the kinds of things I'm most interested in are not they don't give big financial payouts. But for me, they're the interesting ones, because they're right at that margin, and it's right at that intersection between the ecology around us and between people and between other animals and trees, that's where the interesting things are happening. But there's no sort of department of everything, if you want. The closest we've come globally are the Sustainable Development Goals, or the sustainable. There was another set that came out after that they tried to reformulate them a little bit.
I have a childlike question. Are there any diseases that are shared by plants and animals?
Trying to think. That's not my field of study, but I mean, animals eat toxic plants. I can't think of any viruses or bacteria or microbes that go from plants to animals. Probably the ones that would cross over would be, fungi. It depends how you classify them, right? There are fungal diseases in people and other animals. And some of them can be very serious. So yeasts and fungi in the environment, they can infect both plants and different kinds of animals.
Really? Okay.
Including ourselves.
Fungi that do it.
Yeah, that's the only kind of living grouping that I can think of that bridges that the plant kingdom, if you want, and the animal kingdom.
Tell me what you think is going to come of the COVID pandemic in terms of public policy. How is it going to influence the way people make decisions about how to spend the money in preventing future problems? do we have a different perspective on the whole issue because of COVID, or
We
are
have,
we going to go back to doing things the way we've always done it?
I think one of the things that's happened, some for good reasons, some for bad reasons, but I think it's a good outcome, is that governments have looked at supply chains so that we're not importing things from the other side of the world in order to solve problems here. Even in Canada, we didn't have any vaccine production facilities, right? We used to have them, and they closed them down and said, why should we do it? They'll do it in the States, and then we'll just import them here because they can do economies of scale that we don't have. And I think what's happened is that people have realized we need to have some capacity here, response capacity on the lab side, the diagnostic side, the technical side, producing vaccines, masks, those kinds of things. I think the other thing that's happened, not just from this pandemic, but from previous ones, well, avian influenza didn't become pandemic in the sense that it didn't spill over to people and keep being transmitted. I mean, there have been millions and millions of cases in birds, but there have only been 800 and something cases in people. And most of those in people in Southeast Asia that work very closely with chickens.
Sorry, this is avian flu you're talking about?
Yeah, yeah. So I think what's happened is that not just the supply chains for medical supplies and vaccines and drugs and so on, but also for foods. How far do we import these things? Mm-hmm. And if we do import, what kind of quality control do we have? So it's not a matter of saying we either trade with China or we don't trade with China. It's saying we'll trade with a lot of different countries, but we want to make sure that there's a really well-managed quality control over those imports and exports. So it'll slow that down. And I think I see that happening, and I think that's good.
Well, I'd have to say that's is just part of the whole anti-globalization trend. I mean, we now have a whole movement to partly the global economy, but international relations mean that we're, the whole right-wing nationalistic.
And I have to say that I'm not against globalization per se. I'm against reckless globalization, which doesn't pay attention to biology and to ecology and to other animals and so on. So we should be trading with lots of countries around the world. There are good reasons for doing that, but we should be doing it based on a better understanding of the implications of what we're doing. So it's not this or that. It's based on a better understanding of the food, the microbes that are traveling with these things. Mm-hmm. The piece that I don't see being addressed post-COVID very well, maybe it will come, is the whole ecological side, the biodiversity and so on. Mm-hmm. I think it's a source. As soon as you start impinging on wilderness areas, you have, whether it's here or other parts of the world, whether you're mining for ingredients for batteries for electric cars or whether you're mining for something else, you put people into contact with wilderness areas with bacteria, viruses, other animals with whom we haven't had a long history of contact. And so there are bound to be more diseases. I mean, it's not just a matter of sustaining the globe and the oxygen and global warming and so on. It's a matter of, this opens doors to new diseases coming in. People think, well, they come from Southeast Asia. Well, if you put a road through the middle of a wilderness in Alaska, I don't know what is likely to come out of that, because there are areas there where there are animals and plants and microbes, and in a changing climate, there's going to be a different dynamic there. We could be getting things that way, and I don't see that as being part of the One Health discussion nearly as much as it should be.
Well, I mean, you almost touched on the notion of melting permafrost, and when these dormant bacteria come back to life, or viruses or whatever, we're going to have a pandemic of prehistoric origin.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's something like that. I mean, is that realistic? I've heard people talk
Yes.
about anthrax as potentially.
Well, anthrax, I mean, we've had anthrax outbreaks all over North America and around the world. The thing about anthrax is if you get it, it's easily treatable with penicillin.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, the downside is that it exists in between, it exists in spore form. So the bacteria are in spore form, and those spores are incredibly resistant to, desiccation and flooding and all kinds of things. So we have areas of land that have anthrax spores on them. If the climate changes, if it gets warmer, if it gets moister, those spores then say, hey, this is a pretty good climate. Let's get out there and see what we can feed on. And so then you get outbreaks of anthrax. So that is a possibility, yes. Now that you were always, my students used to say, how can you even possibly eat anything or go out? Because all these diseases are out there. I mean, moderation in all things. I mean, you're careful, you wash your hands, you take, I don't get excited about wearing a mask. I've done enough work in Southeast Asia. People wear masks all the time. They have for years and years and years, decades. It wasn't a COVID issue. It was just, the air quality was bad or something like that, or asthma or something. So there are certain things that, you learn to live with, and yeah, some people continue. I remember once at a public health conference saying that I thought a little bit of food poisoning was a good thing because it kept people on their toes. Well, you can imagine that the public health inspectors were not too happy with me saying, and we should relax a little bit. People wanted to irradiate all the food, get rid of all the bacteria.
Yeah.
A few bacteria aren't such a bad thing, It's just we need to bring the load down a little bit. No, we can't do that.
Oh, and you're a man after my own heart, because I have all my friends who come through my kitchen and go digging into my fridge, and if first thing they look at is the expiry date, and they throw my food out, and I think, well, no, it's all right. Smell it first, taste it, look at it. If it looks just bad, throw it out. But otherwise, don't just read the label. I don't believe that.
Right. Yeah. No. And I used to have grad students that would get on my case for not washing my coffee cup enough, or things like that. Come on.
Well, would you say that your students become more cautious as a result of
they're more cautious? I think they're more they become broader thinkers, even if they're focused. I mean, one of them is now director of I think she might even be vice president of IDRC in Ottawa. Some of them are professors. Some of them started their own non-government organizations. So they're active in a variety of ways. And my I don't know, if you're working in the environment we live in now, you can't possibly know everything about everything. So if you're, if you went thousands of years ago, if you're a good hunter, you would have good peripheral vision, right? You're focused on trying to get the deer, but you pay attention to everything that's going on around you. So we're really good at focusing. We can make the best vaccine possible. We're terrible. In order to make that vaccine, though, you have to block out everything else. So what do? Well, we have to be each other's peripheral vision. I think it was Oliver Sacks that said we don't sufficiently honor our peripheral vision. I think he said it in the wake of, he actually physically lost his peripheral vision.
Who did?
And then he starts, Oliver Sacks, who wrote, mistook his wife for a hat and so on.
Right.
He was a clinical neurologist. But in my view, we can't pay attention to everything, but what we can do is create a network of people who are doing lots of different things, and they become our peripheral vision. Say, well, you're working on this, but did you know that this is coming from over here? Or the climate is changing this way, or we're seeing migratory birds die off in another area, and you're focused on this over here. So we need more of that. It's a kind of a communication across all the disciplines.
I think you already referred to that when you talked about this, what I call citizens assembly, or ways in which you're bringing the general people into
Right,
dialogue, but a real diversity of people. I
right.
think it's very interesting, but it also scares me. I think, I know enough people who are
Right.
ordinary, sensible people who have really crazy ideas.
Yeah, I do too, but so it's not everybody, but in the first place, if we can even get scholars, academics to talk to each other across when they used to be called silos, but you know, informing each other what's going along, and within governments where they're setting policies. If you're doing an environmental policy, what are the implications for health and climate and those kind of things, and vice versa? Well, we've got this public health policy. We're going to do this and this and this.
Well, that's really the reason I started this thing called Project Save the World, which has these 6 global threats, and they just, some of them are interdependent with the others.
Right.
And so that you can't, I don't think there's a single one that you could solve all by itself without paying some attention to one of the others. I mean, famine, for example, and pandemics obviously go together. And famine, pandemics, and warfare go together. They're obviously interdependent in various ways. And then you see, we talk about cyber risks, which are obviously connected with warfare. And I mean, and with even, the radioactive, the whole nuclear industry and everything. And so what I created was a website that has a page for each of these 6 global threats, and people could go there and post ideas and information on their particular issue, but at the same time have access immediately to what people are posting on some of the others.
And that's a great idea.
I'm looking for ways of bringing together experts on either so that we have a conversation the way you and I do now, have a conversation between pandemics people and famine people, or experts of different to see this.
Not just public fights over no, it's this or it's that. It's just the conflict is good. I always told my students, the difference between a living dog and a dead dog, after a hit by a car, is not the chemical makeup. It's in one of them, there's this tension, this back and forth of, the living dog, there's a sense of tension within there, feedback loops and those kind. The dead dog has the same chemical makeup and the same microbes. It's just there's no tension there. And so there's a kind of creative tension that we need to maintain, debate and difference. And, we could be wrong. And what can we learn from each other? Those kind of things. Very important.
Yeah, you've already made a huge contribution to it. So
thank you.
It's wonderful. I hope we have further dealings, because I love that approach. And I really hope to be able to support it in some way. So
good talking to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed this. Take care. Okay, bye. Project Save the World produces 2 of these shows each week, and sometimes more. This is episode number 508. You can watch or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. People share information there about 6 global issues. I hope you will too. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can subscribe for $20 Canadian per year. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see buttons to click to subscribe.